talk about integrating Jenkins with GitHub. So up to this point, we've been playing around with some of these Jenkins content, these scripts, but right inside of the user interface. More commonly, right, these Jenkins files will actually live as source code in your original GitHub repository, right? Whether this is Jenkins on a Java a source control that's going to be deployed onto a Java server, or it could be also scripts that run for testing a user interface, right? So the same type of commands that we would expect to be able to test and compile and package Java, you would have also Jenkins for doing similar things for maybe a React or an Angular or whatever user interface you might be using. Now for some of them, if this is Java, the Jenkins file typically will run Maven clean install for testing and packaging the Java portion of your application. But there will be maybe some other Jenkins file that for packaging and testing the React version of your application, where one uses JDK, whereas in Maven, whereas the other one might use NPM and Node.js, right? But nevertheless, the Jenkins files will live at the alongside with the other source code in that particular repository. Okay. Now, typically the life cycle is that a common life cycle between two folks that might be working together. Here's Alice and Bob, A and B. You have Alice that she's coding, she tests, makes sure that it's working locally, and then commits to a local feature branch. And then she creates a push. She pushes it to a remote branch, a remote feature branch, and then creates a PR and assigns it to Bob, to take a look at this and do some code review. And Bob, being satisfied with the content, Bob might merge this into master, right? And this typically would notify Jenkins that hey, the master branch has been checked into, right? And so Jenkins can then automate the process of retrieving the master branch from GitHub, building, compiling, running all the tests locally on the Jenkins machine, making sure that they all pass, right? All the unit tests pass, your integration tests and whatnot, right? And once if it was successful, then it goes on to deploy to production. All right. Again, this might be much more complex. If this is not only production, you might have a QA environment in between. You might have a test environment, a stage environment, and not go directly to production, right? But we're going to follow this simple model that we're going to go directly to production. Now, the Jenkins file, really the content is irrelevant, right? It could be the same type of content that we've had so far. The only thing here that that might be slightly different is that this Jenkins file is not copied and pasted into the user interface. Instead, is a source code, just like any piece of source code that you might already have. Just like another Java file or some JavaScript file or some HTML file. It's just an additional ASCII file that gets added to the source control like just any other file, right? So in this case, it's just a Jenkins file. Now the default name for this file is Jenkins file, capital J. And by default, Jenkins would expect this file to be at the root of the repository. You can configure that if you want to put it somewhere else, but that is the default. In this case, we are pushing it to a repository, and now the Jenkins file is on a GitHub repository. We would then, when we create the pipeline, we would, instead of using what we've been using so far, currently we've been using just pipeline script. Instead, this time we would say that this is a pipeline that you're going to go fetch from source control. All right? So just go fetch it from source control, and then it would ask us, well, what kind of source control is it? Is it GitHub's Subversion? Those are the two main. There's plugins for other, but those are the two mains that are supported out of the box. It asks you also what the name of the repository is, right? And then the branch, right, that you want to check out. All right. So now this one assumes that this repository is public, that it is public available. If it's not public, then this will not work, right? Instead, as we'll see in a minute, if it's not public, if it's private, you need to provide some credentials, right? So that so that Jenkins can log in for you, and work on your behalf. Right? You'll need to get some credentials and some signed credentials for Jenkins to log in. Anyway, so once it is able to connect to it, there's a couple of things that you can automate. Right? For instance, one of the things you could do is to tell Jenkins what to do with this repository. What should I do with it? Right? There's a few things that you could do. You can ask Jenkins to, for instance, periodically, right, go out and see if there's any changes. Has anything changed? Any new files? And it can check to see if indeed there are any changes. It will go and fetch and check out your repository, copy all the files locally onto the Jenkins machine, and execute the Jenkins file. All right. Before we leave that, you can set up how frequent do you want this to happen. Right, you can say, oh, I want it to happen every minute, every hour, every day, right? More commonly, in industry, typically this is configured to be maybe half hour or maybe every 1 hour, right? But it depends. It's different for every team, right? For every organization, right? So for instance, they might have the QA environment running every half hour, right? So that whatever you check in, you can expect that it will be deployed onto the QA environment within a half hour, right? That every half hour on the hour, right, it'll pick it up, and then you can go to the QA environment and see if the build was successful or if it failed, right? And you need to stay. If it failed, you need to stay and make sure that the QA environment does succeed, before going home, right? You should not leave a broken build unattended. The other alternative is to have Jenkins to go and be notified instead of Jenkins going out and polling and asking GitHub, hey, has anything changed since the last time? You can have it the other way around. You can have GitHub notify Jenkins and say, hey, Jenkins, somebody just submitted something. Kick off a build. Right? For this, we would need additional configuration through webhooks and have Jenkins log in and identify itself and register itself as a someone to be notified, right? And then GitHub can then send a notification to Jenkins for automatically kicking off a build. Right. So for instance, here's an example. If you run this, notice that it went out and obtain Jenkins file from that GitHub repository. There it is, right here. Right, and it used the git commands, right, to set up the remote origins, right, to be pointing to your particular repository. Right, it then did a checkout. It went out and actually retrieved the latest content from the repository. If internally you had a Maven clean install, it would run Maven clean install. In this case, it just did a hello world and it did an ls and a pwd and whatnot, right? Now, if you want more rigorous integration with GitHub, you need to provide access tokens, right? For instance, if you want to have it the other way around, where GitHub comes back to you and notifies you, you need to retrieve GitHub access tokens. So let's see that.